Hello and welcome to this episode of How to Be a Great GM. I am Guy and I am your god. No, I'm not. But I do pretend to be a whole range of gods in my role-playing game. And as a result of questions asked on the website, we are looking at pantheons today, quite obviously, as in the thumbnail, obviously. Pantheons are an interesting space to play in, and I got some advice the other day from a friend of mine who said that your pantheon should be at the same age restriction as the people playing the game. And I thought for a moment, then I realized he's absolutely right. The pantheon, by default, is generally a very sexually charged space. Most of the pantheons that we have in Earth's cultures generally revolve around a father, a son, a mother, a daughter, some incest, some outcest, some interspecies cest. It's basically just a whole bunch of very horny people who have lots of power and a lot of time in which to do nothing. So think about that before you even start. What kind of pantheon are you going to have? And that's a bit of a roundabout way to get to my first point. Do you have an involved pantheon or do you have a dispassionate pantheon? And that is a very, very, very important starting point. If it is a dispassionate, if it is an uninvolved pantheon, the gods are in the sky, they don't respond to the pleas of the mortal man, theirs are affairs far beyond the comprehension of anyone who's on the planet, and they do not intervene with the affairs of the mortals downstairs. Then that's fine. Then your pantheon can be whatever you want it to be, and you can describe it in the various ways that I'm going to show you a little bit later. You don't have to pay too much attention. It's not paying attention to your players or their characters, so why do they need to pay attention to it? On the other hand, if you have an involved pantheon, such as, say, the Greek gods were heavily involved with the Greek affairs, as were the Roman gods, where you could appease them and they could walk amongst mortal man and shag mortal woman and just cause a mortal mess. If you have involved gods, then you need to start considering a whole bunch of very different questions, and it can change the face of your campaign quite dramatically. So it's important to realize just how your gods interact with mortals. And the very first question that you always have to ask is the creation myth. With dispassionate gods, they created the mortals, set them on their course, and now are observing, or are not observing, depending on your approach. They're just letting things unfold, and then once the mortal has died, then they get involved in the mortal's life. But they created the mortals in a fashion and a reason. Perhaps the mortals stole some clay and forged themselves, however you want to do it. With involved gods, where the gods are actually walking around their creations, that speaks a lot more about a familial sense. The gods want to be part of the humans' lives. They enjoy the mortal being's existence. That's important to realize. It starts to mean that you can have player characters, as they achieve power, start to actually have interactions with the gods. Because if the gods are involved, then they're going to want to be involved with the most powerful people on the planet, especially if those people represent them. So it starts to affect how you are going to interact, your gods, with your players' characters, doesn't it? Very, very much so. It starts to then mean that your players and their characters should have a way of contacting those gods, and the gods should have a way of representing themselves and coming down. So it adds a complexity level that dispassionate gods do not necessarily have. So with that in mind, so with the idea that you've got involved gods, you've got dispassionate gods, you've got these two different pantheons that are busy running. Something that we need to address before we get to breaking down the actual pantheon itself and how do we come up with that. Something that we need to address is, do you have a singular pantheon that the entire world believes in, the entire fantasy world believes in, or do you have multiple pantheons? If you have multiple pantheons, are they exclusive or are they inclusive? In the ancient world, we know that the Romans were quite happy for a temple of Isis, an Egyptian goddess, to be next to the temple of Juno, a Greek Roman god. They were quite happy for the two temples to exist next to each other, and for patrons to wander into the temple of Isis, pray to her for good familial issues, and then move over to Juno and pray for war or success or etc., etc., etc. They didn't have an issue with interfaith migration of people. They really didn't mind. It was only when upstarts came along that were preaching that there's only one true being of ultimate power that issues started to creep in. But for the most part, they were quite happy to include everybody's gods. Is your pantheon like that? Are they at war with each other? Do the different pantheons vie for control of the spiritual power that their mortals produce? That's up to you, and it's a decision that will affect your campaign in various different ways. Either there'll be faith wars, or there won't be. Either the party will have clerics who have to argue with each other, or that it can work together. That is a decision that you need to make, and it's all about the tone of your campaign. Something that I strongly suggest against, and this is a personal opinion, well, the whole video is a personal opinion, but this is much more of a personal opinion than anything else. The idea that you have gods, whether they're a pantheon or whether they're just individual gods, that have got different names for the different races. So in other words, the elves call this particular god Dandelion, the gnomes call him Hollyhock, and the humans call the deity Desk Table Lamp. The idea is multiple names make it sound as if the different races worship the same god, but call them different things. It's just confusing for players, and it doesn't really add a huge amount of value. If the elves have their own pantheon, or their own singular god that they worship, and the humans have their own gods, and they worship them separately, that creates an interesting space. Why? Because there's potential for conflict, and that's conflict that the party members can participate in. If it is the same god that everyone is worshipping, and it's just different names, that causes conflict for the player. Wait, what god? Who? What's his name? Oh, it's that. Oh, that's the same one as Hollyhock. Okay, I'm just going to call it Hollyhock. So in other words, they're erasing your efforts and just sticking to something that's easy for them to remember. Make it separate pantheons that have got animosity between each other or that don't. Now suddenly it starts to become a little bit more interesting for the players to engage in multiple different pantheons and different god styles. It's just something that I've noticed over time. Different names for the same thing just cause issues. Just don't do it. My advice. Right. So that's the overview of gods handled. If we now look at the minutiae, the detailing that's going to make this pantheon work. Generally, pantheons are hierarchical in nature. There is the king god, the queen goddess, the ultimate original creator god. Then they have husbands and wives and siblings, and then those have children, and those children are the lesser gods, and then there's lower down you get demigods and etc., 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 etc. So that's usually the flow of things. You have all sorts of alternative options, but generally speaking, that's how it's kind of structured. You are not limited to a specific number of gods either. However, again, generally speaking, if you have a god of rivers, and you have a god of streams, and you have a god of ponds, and you have a god of lakes, and you have a god of oceans, that's okay. But you might start to get confused as to which god is necessarily doing what. I know in our own cultures we certainly had that, absolutely. There were little local gods that were responsible for little local areas, as well as the bigger gods. So those were sort of demigods, if you like. You can add in as much flavor as you like. You've just got to keep track of it and make sure that your players are interested in keeping track of it as well. Something that I find often is that I have players who play clerics who don't bother to even know too much about their god. If you've got this information, give it to the cleric and make sure to test them on it from time to time. You don't have to take their notes away. Just simply ask them, well, what's the manifestation of your god when they are walking on water? Or what is the manifestation of your god when they're walking on lava? Do they have different manifestation states? Do they manifest? All those kinds of questions you should be prompting to the cleric and the paladin, for that matter, because that's part of who their character is. By not referencing the gods when dealing with clerics and paladins, you are denying them an opportunity to explore your world and for you to be able to demonstrate that you have got all of this information that you have so conscientiously written down. So remember to do that from time to time. All right, so the gods obviously need a name, and I've addressed multiple names for the same god from different races, so just don't do that. They need an area of focus. Now, generally speaking, it was broad strokes, and it was, in the past anyway, certainly very heteronormative. Female gods were responsible for birth, for the home, for health, for wisdom, for understanding, that kind of thing. Male gods generally were for violence and war and that kind of thing. You can challenge that however you like. I would encourage you to do so, but that's where it comes from, is that we usually have this division of abilities and powers. There are, of course, exceptions to that whole thing, and that's fantastic that they're there. So their area of focus. You then need to look at their relationship to the other gods. Now, this is where it can become complicated. So I'd always suggest that you do like a family tree, or you do a multiple trees of the different gods in the pantheon that you have, and then you do the relationships. So these are the physical relationships. She is the daughter of this one and that one. He is the son of this one and that one, and he begot her and she begot him, and together they begot them, and etc., etc., etc. So you can do the physical. But then I would also do the interrelated. Now, if your gods are dispassionate gods, this really doesn't matter. The players are never going to encounter this aside from stories and narratives. If your gods are involved gods, however, this is where it becomes important. If he hates this one, and she loves that one, and he loves her, but none of them do this, all that you're doing is you are creating the potential for high-level adventures, or low-level adventures, but high-level adventures where the characters are assisting the gods to achieve those goals. Now, we know throughout our history that humans have involved themselves with the gods' affairs multiple times and have been pawns of the gods and used by the gods and manipulated by the gods. This is just giving you, as the game master, the opportunity to explore these kinds of bigger concepts. Imagine if your goddess of love was actually, if she hated the god of oceans. And so she creates this avatar who enlists the help of the players to go and slay the avatar of the god of the water, of the oceans, because that's the revenge that she wants to get. Imagine when they discover that. That kind of interplay has come about because of the relationships that you've established way on earlier. So you can start to play out those kinds of relationships between the gods, as well as their actual relationships. Their powers. You need to describe and outline their powers. Now, generally speaking, the pantheonic gods were not omnipresent, omnipotent. They generally had a flaw. They could be killed. They didn't necessarily have immortality. They were not as powerful as they might want to be. They had limitations. They had restrictions. They had flaws. That's because the gods at the time were invented by humans who had those same flaws, so they just invested them with those same issues. You need to do the same with your gods as well. If player characters can interact with gods, that means that they should be able to become a god. There were many ways that you could become a god in the ancient world. You could become pharaoh and suddenly you're a god. Or you could climb a mountain, steal fire, do some various things, sleep with a goddess, that kind of stuff. So think about those kinds of powers. So not just the power that the god has to control the oceans because he's the god of the oceans, but what are the limitations of his power? Can he control all liquids, or is it only H2O? So in other words, if we entrap him in a tank of vinegar, he's going to drown. So the idea is that you create these fallible beings that have the capacity to be defeated, but it's a secret, perhaps. Imagine if the players were to discover this ancient scroll upon which the goddess of love indicated that if she was ever to be told that she was ugly, she would turn to stone and die. Well, there is something now that starts to become an adventure. Who knows? Well, you do, hopefully, once you've finished creating your gods. You need to create their champions. Who are people that in the past or currently are the champions of those gods? The players, of course, are going to be going up in level and that kind of thing, but at the beginning there needs to be famous paladins, famous clerics who work for these gods and who the characters might know. It gives flavour and adds a sense of importance to the gods that oftentimes is overlooked. What are the symbols of the god? Now, here you need to be fairly careful. Again, in our ancient cultures where we had lots of pantheons, generally a lot of the symbols were very sexual in nature. That was one of the major concerns of the populations at the time. So you had phalluses and fallopian tube-like shapes and all kinds of weird and wonderful objects representing the gods in the past. You need to consider your audience that's sitting at your table and adjust accordingly. Again, though, the idea that the symbol should represent the individual is a very important one. Something that I like to try and do whenever I'm creating a pantheon is work out what is the physical symbol of the god. Now, if you've ever seen a Catholic situation in a film, in any kind of expression of Catholicism, it's always the making of the cross. That is a very powerful symbol. That means it's something that your players can use to really get into the spirit of being a cleric or a priest of that nature. So maybe they need to do an infinity sign every time they mention the god's name. Maybe they need to do a square. Maybe they need to touch the forehead and then both ears. Perhaps they need to rub their ears. Perhaps they need to touch their lips and their nose and their forehead. Perhaps they need to tap both shoulders, tap the chin, and then brush away the evil spirit. Physical representation doesn't take much, but it starts to make that pantheon, that particular god, that much more real. Now, obviously, you don't want your players to start worshipping the gods that you've invented. That would require you to write at least one book first before they went off and did that. No, so the idea is that you want to make it as fantastically real as possible, and that includes these small little gestures and symbols. So think about that. Colours often help as well. I like to think of as gods in specific colours. And of course I think one can go, well, Poseidon is blue, Zeus is maybe red or yellow, I suppose, thunderbolts. Or maybe he's a light blue, sky blue, the colour of the sky. Hades is black or red. No, Apollo is red, the god of war. No, that's not Apollo. That's Apollo's the sun. That's yellow, definitely. So perhaps it's Ares, the god of war. It's entirely up to you, but colour can often be a very powerful way of associating gods and letting the players know when they walk into a temple and they see all of this red everywhere that we've walked into a temple of Reft, or whoever your god might be. A weapon of choice. Now, oftentimes the rulebooks prescribe this is the favoured weapon, this is the symbol, this is this. Making it your own, I think, makes it much more powerful. And a weapon of choice, it could be words. It could be a specific word. Think of Skyrim, for example, where it's a power word. Maybe it doesn't have to go that far. Maybe it's simply Agnus Dei or Filii Sanctus, whatever. Think of the words that could be associated with that being as being their weapons of choice. Or is it a mace, or is it a spear, or is it a sword? Do they even need to have one? Maybe it's a pen, if the pen is mighty and the sword is according to... You get the idea. What does the god look like when they manifest? I hinted at this before. So when the god presents themselves on the planet, do they go for a Larry King interview and set up a Facebook page? How do they do it? How do they make themselves known? Is it in the form of a swan, as Zeus was so fond of doing, or an eagle? Or is it an eel? Is it a goat? Is it another human being with golden hair? Is it a young 12-year-old boy with freckles? Who knows? You do. Make sure that you know that, so that when they do manifest, you can have a running theme, so that if your players are going to be encountering, if their characters are going to be encountering the gods quite often, when they start to encounter the same god who wears winged shoes, they start to realize that this is the same person, or that there is a continuity of character here, and that must mean X and Y. Those are the kind of finesse clues that you can build into your pantheon to really make your gods stand out quite physically and literally in the crowd. Gods are tricky. Once players have access to gods, they have access to a lot of power. But remember, gods are fickle. in a pantheon, generally speaking. They all want power, and those little relationships that you've built, the physical ones as well as the power relationships, can be swayed and swung. That brings me to my next point. Your pantheon needs to have rules. Most pantheons have rules. Whether it's set by the leader of the pantheon, the queen or the king or the emperor, the empress, whether they dictate how the rest of the gods will work, or whether there is more to it. Maybe there's a universal rule that the gods themselves cannot break. We shall not directly interfere, but we'll send minions and we'll do this and we'll do that. What happens if they break the rules? But what are those rules? You need to know about that. And the book's sometimes very light in terms of the gods' involvement in the story. Do they involve? Don't they involve? How involved do they get? And what are the ramifications thereof? So that is something that's very, very important to look at. Is what are the rules that constrain the gods themselves, and where are the loopholes so that the player characters can get involved in that. Another idea to bear in mind is to maybe have notable events. So something that the cleric or the paladin can refer to or can be referred to. Remember the time of the great sundering when the great god Dictaphone managed to defeat the god Lampstand. It was a spectacular battle, and we must all refer to it with grace because it was the beginning of the end of the stationary wars. I say nothing more. I probably shouldn't say anything more. So, right. What do the gods do within your campaign? What does your pantheon do within your campaign, apart from cause all this mischief and be involved and not involved? We've now established how to kind of come up with gods, what they need to be, what elements they need to have for players to really dig into them. But what do they do within your campaign? They set the tone for your campaign. If you look at, say, the Egyptian gods were there to keep the Egyptians on the straight and narrow and to be appeased from time to time. If the priests didn't do their job, the gods got very, very involved in the lives of the Egyptians. But the average Egyptian didn't really have much truck with them. They'd go to the priest and the priest would intercede on their behalf. Later on, within the Roman space, people would go to temples to intercede, and of course the gods would still be there, but the gods were far more involved in local areas, local opinion polls were run and that sort of thing. Later on, it becomes the individual who has to intercede on their own behalf with the gods because it's a one-on-one relationship. It's much more personal. We've eliminated the priesthood and now it becomes the spiritual journey that we go on. So you've got to look at that. And what that does is that, as I said, sets the tone. The gods could be vindictive. The gods could be passive. The gods could be active. The gods could be fickle in terms of, yes, you've given me a good sacrifice, so I'll make sure that something happens to you that's nice. If that's the prevailing thought, your players' characters need to have access to that as well. And that's something that you'll have to tell them right from the beginning. Now, within my own games, I like my gods to be involved. They're just another story element that I can use to tell interesting stories. And I had one campaign which started out as a fairly innocuous little thing. One player eventually rose to become the one true god. The other player's characters, by accident, by manipulation, by story flow, assassinated other gods on behalf of this one player character. They didn't want to do it, but it just kind of happened by accident. One thief happened to stab someone in the night who happened to be glowing, and that was a god of colour, I think it was, and so the whole world lost colour. Anyway, the idea is that I like to have my gods involved. So you need to be able to have your player characters involve themselves. So what I do is whenever a character offers up a prayer to their particular god, I get them to roll a D100. If they roll 1%, the god intercedes. Now, if that god is the god of knowledge and they've asked for a boon of knowledge, let us understand this riddle, let us do this, let us do that, the god is helpful and will allow them to not necessarily just walk through it, but to do it in exchange for something. Gods will not do anything for free. They require additional worship or a sacrifice or this or that or the next thing. That's also something that you must determine. If, however, it's the god of knowledge and the player asks the god of knowledge to smite their enemy, knowledge has nothing to do with physical action of smiting, so the god will simply cause the being to cease existing, or will curse them with having their legs and arms fall off. Smite them now. Ha! and then disappear. So the players know that they can have their characters pray to my gods, and my gods may or may not appear. It depends entirely on the dice roll. And they need to make sure that when they do appear, they appear for the right reasons. So that's something that you can bring in. But I tell my players before the game starts, this is the status quo and this is the ramifications thereof. Because my gods are involved gods. So they set the tone. We have talked about setting how you kill the gods. That's all part of setting the tone, giving that idea that the player characters could, if they wanted to, go off in that direction. Bearing in mind that, of course, the players themselves are going to be determining just how much involvement they have with the gods. If they are going to do lots of prayer work, if there's no clerics and no paladins in the party, then it isn't likely something that is going to come up. You can still save them for adventures later on where you do involve them, but generally speaking it won't be. If there are clerics and paladins running around who are actively praying to the gods, then you need to have all this information at your fingertips. Finally, we then need to look at the cults and the extremists that exist around the Pantheon, and they are always going to exist. Power-hungry people use the gods for their own gain. They claim to be able to have a direct line to the god, and so run cults, arena pits, whatever. You can then insert those quite happily into the space if you've got involved gods anyway, and have wonderful adventures with your characters trying to stop these cults from existing, or from being chased by a specific cult who feels that they've infringed on the rights of a specific god or a manifestation of that particular god. All those kinds of wonderful things. So cults are there to basically support the Pantheon from a very diabolical kind of way, if you like, or possibly from a passive way if it's a cult of healers who run around forcing you to take your medicine. I'm not entirely sure how that would play out, but it's something worth considering. So a Pantheon, to build a Pantheon, is something that maybe, if you want, we can look at and for your consideration, where we actually structure out a Pantheon in its entirety. But generally speaking, a Pantheon is there to provide your player characters with a grounding for their divine powers to have come from somewhere, and it is to provide you with the ability to have this beyond the player character power base, being involved and causing these rather earth-shattering events to happen, and to just be able to introduce adventures that are slightly out of the world space, because that's on a deity level, and that's an interesting space to be in. Until next time, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button if you want to see more. Don't forget you can head on over to www.rpgtablefinder.com, where you can sign up and create virtual tables where there's dice rollers and there's chat channels, so you can set up your role-playing groups there and coordinate whether you play online or actually around a table. It's quite a functional space. And of course you can also head over to www.worldanvil.com if you are creating your campaign, and use their facilities where they will prompt you for your gods, and they'll take you through a wonderful walkthrough of all of the information that you need in terms of being able to describe and articulate those particular gods that you are going to be using. So go and have a look at those two websites if you want to drive your game to just that next level. Until next time, however, I wish you and yours the happiest of gaming.